What I'm been going to talk to you today about is the ship Vasa, which I trust many of you know a little bit about, but also to talk about very specifically the people, the crew, the shipboard community. For those who don't know what Vasa is, this is a picture of it. In the 1620s, the King of Sweden was at war with his first cousin, the King of Poland and Lithuania, Gustav Adolf on the left from Sweden, Zygmunt Vasa on the right from Poland. Part of the war was based on a dynastic claim because both were the grandsons of a king of Sweden. Both claimed the Swedish throne. Gustav Adolf was actually sitting on it, but it also had economic roots. As part of this war, the king had embarked on a program of, the King of Sweden had embarked on a program of renewal and expansion of his navy. And this included building more ships, but also new types of ships. This is a Dutch woodcut or an engraving of a ship built for the French Navy in the Netherlands in the 1620s. And this is the sort of ship that Gustav Adolf wanted to add to his navy. A ship with 2 full decks of guns, plus lighter guns on the upper deck, a configuration that would eventually become a fairly standard part of the fleets of large nations, like England, like France. Eventually it would be called a third rate or a 74-gun ship. And so in the winter of 1624, 1625, he signed a contract with 2 Dutch entrepreneurs to run the naval yard in Stockholm. This is a model of it as we think it looked in the 1620s, to maintain all the ships of the Swedish Navy and to build 4 new ships. 2 of these would be this new type of with 2 full gun decks. These were to be armed with 72 guns. These were a new type of armament as well, a lightweight 24-pounder gun on both the gun decks. And so when these ships were launched, they would be the most powerfully armed warships in the world, as far as we can tell. The first of these to be built, which you can see nearing completion here, was eventually named Vasa, which means the bundle of sticks, or a fascine. And the Vasa is the heraldic symbol of the king's family, which is why it has that name. The ship, however, was not a very good design. We believe it's the first ship with 2 full gun decks designed and built by this master builder. And so like a lot of ships with multiple gun decks in the 17th century, it was not terribly stable when first put into service. And so on its maiden voyage, leaving Stockholm Harbor in the late afternoon of the 10th of August, 1628, a gust of wind filled the sails, and it heeled the ship over to port so far that water ran in through the open gun ports, filled up the ship, and it went to the bottom like a stone. So as I said, it was the most powerfully armed warship in the world, but only for about 45 minutes. The ship itself was still valuable, even though it was sunk. There were several attempts to raise the vessel. The very first one was by an English engineer named Ian Bulmer, who succeeded in getting the ship upright on the bottom, but not in raising it. Eventually, a group of entrepreneurs using a diving bell managed to recover most of the ship's guns in the 1660s and export them where they were sold. We don't yet know to whom they were sold, but we know that one of the customers they talked to was the Board of Ordnance of Britain, who was then engaged in a war with the Dutch. They also talked to the Dutch. And so the entrepreneurs were trying to sell the guns in the summer of 1665. We have a problem, we have a separate project looking at what might have become of those. The ship itself was not lost to history. It was a known feature of the harbor bottom. But in the 1950s, it was relocated by an archaeologist, well, amateur archaeologist, although he always hated that term, a private person who was an engineer in the Navy, was interested in the history of the Navy, and he located the ship in 1956, persuaded the Navy, the National Heritage Board, the National Maritime Museum, and the largest private salvage company in Scandinavia to all join together in a project to raise the ship and make it the centerpiece for a new museum. And so for 4.5 years, divers in conventional heavy dress dug 6 tunnels under the ship to pass steel cables under it, which allowed it to be lifted very slowly and moved into shallower water where the gun ports were all closed in. The broken stern and bow were closed in. And then a few objects, about 1,000 objects, were raised in that process. Here you can see one of the ship's 3 remaining cannon that were was raised at that point. And then in the spring of 1961, the ship was brought to the surface, where it was, once the upper edge of the hull was clear of the water, large pumps were put inside, and it was successfully pumped out and refloated after 333 years on the bottom of the harbor. The oldest ship ever successfully refloated. And for one day, it floated on its own keel. You can see that in the photo on the right. And the ship was brought into a dry dock, placed on a concrete pontoon and put up on props so that it could be moved around the harbor. It still stands on that pontoon today, which allowed it to be moved into the modern Vasa Museum, which was built over an old dry dock. Once the ship was out of the water, a team of archaeologists, all young graduates in archaeology, art history, and ethnography, came on board and spent the next 5 months excavating the structure. There was no real archaeological precedent for this. It was a 4-story at that point structure with its content still in place. Nobody had ever tried to excavate something like that in the past, although the 2-story tenements in Ostia, the port of ancient Rome, is probably the closest parallel. And what they found on board was most everything that had been on the ship when it sank, with the exception of the artillery that had been raised in the 1660s, and then some of the more fragile organic materials. And unfortunately, all of the iron. The conditions on the bottom were very good for the preservation of organic material, but really terrible for the preservation of metals. So virtually all of the wrought iron in the ship disappeared. Thousands of bolts and nails, tools. We say a collection of about 250 tools, but mostly what we have is sticks about 2 feet long that once had axe and adze heads on them. And so they recovered in the course of that excavation a total of about 40,000 objects. That's padding the numbers a little bit. 9,000 of those are lead musket shot, but we have what we usually say is about 30,000 discrete find numbers, although some of those represent multiple objects. This is a view of the inside of the orlop, a storage deck below the lower gun deck, towards the stern, where you can see a gun carriage. That's actually 2 gun carriages there, which were empty at the time the ship sank. And then there's a black mass in front of that in the foreground. That's actually a pile of sails from the rig. Only 4 of the ship's 10 sails were mounted on the yards. The rest were found still folded in the sail room down on the orlop, just in front of these gun carriages. The ship was conserved and restored over the course of about 35 years, which included reassembling the loose pieces that were found around it on the bottom, replacing all the iron nails and bolts. The gentleman at the bottom is driving one of the new bolts. It's not red hot. It's painted with a red epoxy, which gives it that appearance. And in fact, even re-rigging the lower masts, since the lower foremast and mainmast were found. They were complete, even the tops, as well as a lot of the rigging hardware. So it was possible to re-rig the lower masts and the bowsprit once the ship was moved into the new museum. As it stands in the museum today, the ship is right around 69 meters long, including the bowsprit, but we now know that's wrong. The reconstructed bowsprit is probably 1 or 2 meters too long. It's a little less than 12 meters wide, about 19 meters high at the stern, and in service, it would have had a displacement around 1,300 tons. As it's displayed in the museum now, we estimate it's closer to 900 tons of weight. And the original wooden structure of the hull, a little bit more than 98% survives. Very little is actually missing, and it's mostly the upper deck planking, which was ripped up in the process of salvaging the guns in the 1660s. And this forms the centerpiece of the most popular maritime museum in the world. And until this spring and the COVID pandemic, we had about 1.5 million visitors annually from all over the world. We have a large number of research themes at the Vasa Museum, looking at all the different aspects of life that the ship can reveal. What I'd like to talk to you about today is a research theme that we call Who Are You? And that is looking at the people who were involved in the ship as individuals. Here you see a diver with the skull of somebody who had died on the wreck. That's actually the skull of a woman that was found on the upper gun deck. And we have human remains. We have other clues as to who the people on board the ship were. I will warn you, there will be more photographs of human remains. So if you don't like that kind of thing, now is the time to switch on the football. If we look at the people connected to Vasa, we can break them into groups based on how close their connection is. There are the people who were on board the ship when it sailed, the crew and their guests. But you also have the people who built the ship, people in the shipyard. You have the people in the countryside who were providing raw materials for the ship, the foresters who were providing timber, the miners who were, and foundry workers who were providing the metal for the guns and all of the iron fittings. And you even have people abroad who were directly connected to the ship. There were weavers in France producing sailcloth that eventually found its way into the rigging of Vasa. And so we can look at all of those people, and those boundaries between those groups are fluid because people move across those boundaries. We know that some of the carpenters who helped build the ship were then sent on board the ship as part of the crew to look after the maintenance. What I'd like to tell you about today is just the people on board the ship. In the conventional British naval nomenclature, we would call them Vasa's people, or even we would just call them Vasas. But in this case, we know something about who was on board at the time, both from historical sources, but also from the remains of people who did not make it out of the ship before it sank. We know how big the crew was supposed to be. According to the manning list for 1628, in which Vasa is the second ship listed, it's called Valsen here, which means the bundle of sticks. The crew should have consisted of 133 mariners, sjöfolk, seamen, who would sail the ship, plus 300 soldiers, 2 companies, whose job it was to man the cannon and fight boarding battles. They were a separate part of the crew still in the Swedish Navy. At this point, the English Navy, for example, had already gone to a unified crew in which members of the crew were expected to both be able to sail and to fight. In the Swedish Navy, those functions were still separated. In addition, you had about 15 what we would call daymen. These are people like the cook, the priest, a trumpeter, the carpenters, servants, people who didn't stand a watch, but who provided specialist functions of various types. And I like to think we can count 2 cats as part of the crew, and that they had a job to do. They were there to keep the rat population in check. Of these people, the soldiers were not yet on board. You only took them on board if you were headed out to a war theater, and Vasa wasn't going there yet. So we know that there should have been something like 133 mariners, plus the daymen and cats. But crew members in the Swedish Navy were also allowed to have their wives on board, as long as the ship was not going to be meeting the enemy. So as long as you were in home waters. And we know from historical accounts that there were women and children on board the ship when it sank. From the historical accounts, we also know that about 30 people died. This is a very small disaster in human terms. If you compare Mary Rose, where you have hundreds of people dying, or the biggest disaster in Swedish history, Cronin, more than 800 fatalities. And on that shipwreck, they don't even count the remains in terms of individual people. They measure hundreds of kilograms of human bone recovered. So unfortunately, the cats are among the dead. Well, at least 2 of them are. There may have been more. And we know among the dead, there were women and children. In the course of the excavation, about 1,500 human bones, as well as some soft tissue, were recovered by archaeologists, actually some by the divers. This is the collection of bones that were found in the ship, being looked at by an osteologist in about 1962. Some other remains were found outside the ship later on in the 1960s. The remains found in the ship after an initial examination were buried in the National Naval Cemetery in this grave with an anchor that had been found on the ship on top of it. These individuals were later disinterred in 1989 for further study. The individuals that we have found associated with the ship include either 11 or 12 well-defined individuals inside the ship, plus 4 or 5 individuals in the wreckage outside the stern. Generally speaking, these bones are found as well-localized deposits of one person, but there are a few other bones that we cannot necessarily account for in terms of those well-defined skeletons. So we think we have bones from at least 2 other people. For example, there is a pair of boots found just in front of the ship that are the same type as the boots found on the ship, and those boots had a pair of feet in them, but that's all we have of that person. If we look at how they're distributed in the decks, we can see they're relatively well spread out in most cases. You'll see names attached to these individuals. We have no idea who the dead are. They're mostly anonymous. We only know the name of one person who died in the wreckage, Captain Hans Jonsson, because he was mentioned in the report to the king, probably because he was a friend of the king's. But in these cases, the skeletons that were found were given letter designations in the order they were found, A, B, C, D, E, F. And then when the skeletons were studied in the 1990s, the osteologist who did so thought that was dehumanizing. And so she assigned names to them to make them people rather than objects. And so those were simply expanded according to the Swedish radio code. So our skeletons are Adam, Beata, Caesar, David, Eric, Philip, etc. Here you can see the distribution of the ones who were found on the deck. We know that most people who died in the wreck were those who couldn't get out of the ship. The ship was only 120 meters from shore. If you could swim, then it was an easy swim. If you couldn't swim, even after the ship sank, the masts were poking out of the water. There was something to hang on to until a boat could come and pick you up. And then lower, those were the 2 upper decks, the gun decks. Lower down in the ship, we really don't have much in the way of human remains. Most people were on deck when the ship sank and could get away, and those who were not tended to be lower down. It may also be that some of those people had started farther down in the ship and then had managed to climb up a deck or 2 before it sank. Although in the case of Johan, we have fairly good circumstantial evidence that he was higher up and had fallen in the course of the sinking into that location. There's one of our odd bones is also in the hold farther aft. It's a single upper arm bone from a small child, less than 10 years old, although we don't have anything else of that skeleton. In summary, the adult males, which number at least 13, range in age between the late teens and the early 50s or maybe later. It's difficult to tell the age of a skeleton once they get much past about 30. And most of these men are in their 20s and 30s, as you might expect. They range in height from 160 to 176 centimeters, an average height of about 165, 166, which is about 5'5". By comparison, that's an inch or more shorter than the average crew on Mary Rose. So the myth of the tall Scandinavian is pretty much busted here. There are 2 females among these, at least 2 females among these skeletons. They're both in their 20s or possibly 30s, and both about 160, 163 centimeters, which is the average for women in that period. And that one child whose sex is not determined, but is less than 10 years old. Recently, in addition to conventional osteological and archaeological analysis, we've also been taking DNA samples to try to learn more about the people on board. Here, the DNA technicians from Uppsala University are removing the petrous bone, which is the bone that your ear canal goes through in your skull. They've discovered that that's the best place to recover DNA in an archaeological skeleton. Used to think it was teeth, but they've since discovered that this thick bone, the base of your skull, is even better. Unfortunately, it does require sawing a chunk out of a skull in order to get to the DNA. These are a few of the people we've been able to say something about through analysis. This process of reconstructing the faces is by now very well known by rebuilding the tissue onto the skull, because most of what determines what you look like is the shape of your skull. Most of us, the thickness of the muscle and fat and skin on our faces is more or less the same, depending on what ethnic or what race you belong to. But it's the case that in court cases, they've found that they can more often than not get an identification on a murder victim this way, even if you get the race wrong. And so this is a reasonably accurate way of recreating what these people look like. This is Ivar, who's one of our two older men. He's somewhere in his 40s or 50s, we believe, has seen quite a lot of hard life. He has a dent in the back of his skull. It's a healed fracture that looks like a sword cut. And he was, when he was found, he had a musket, a matchlock musket, and a lantern with him. He was well down in the ship in the little room just above the powder magazine. It was very common to have somebody guarding the powder magazine, and that's probably what he was doing. So he might have looked something like the gentleman down here with his musket saying hello. Adam is, we believe, a conventional or ordinary crew member. He's in his 30s, average height. Like most of them, he has healed broken bones. In his case, quite a dramatic facial fracture. You can see he has a crooked nose. At some point, he was hit in the face with a heavy object that crushed the sinuses above and below his right eye, distorted his eye socket, broke his nose, and bent it off to the left. Modern facial surgeons consider this a category 2 out of a possible 3 facial fracture, and it probably left him with recurrent headaches and sinus troubles. He's also the only member we have, the only crew member we have who appears to have an injury associated with the sinking, and that's a complete fracture of his right lower leg. Philip, you can see that he was found here in the steerage, that is where the whipstaff was. He's an interesting fellow in a number of ways. He's very small. He's only about 160 centimeters tall and probably weighed less than 45 kilograms, soaking wet. He was extremely skinny, but we also can tell from chemical analysis of his bones that almost all of his protein came from plants. He was a vegetarian, effectively, although probably not as a lifestyle choice. He has a malformation in his lower jaw, and that he has an extra set of adult teeth, which meant that his bite didn't close properly. And so and there's no wear on his back teeth, suggesting that he had to eat mostly soup, salad, and porridge for his nourishment. He also had a bizarre injury to his elbows. He had at one point fallen on his elbows and punched his ulnas, that's the lower arm bone, up into the upper arm bone and made a hole in the end of the upper arm bone, and which was in the process of healing, but it must have caused him some discomfort in his elbows. He may have been one of the ship's officers. He was found with a sword. Helge is probably the best preserved individual on board. He was found still looking somewhat like a body, trapped underneath a gun carriage and lying over top of anchor cable ranged along the deck. He is one of the ones who has soft tissue preserved, an intact brain, for example, although it's now completely saponified. It's soap, it doesn't tell us anything. But also his hair and fingernails and toenails survived. This is the one person, Yuan, who we might be able to identify. He's an older man, probably over 50, perhaps in his 60s. He's lost almost all of the molars in his lower jaw, so he had to chew mostly with his front teeth and the one remaining bicuspids. His bones are almost completely fused, and he has a number of injuries that would have made him limp. His big toe had been amputated at some point earlier in life. This is a reconstruction of how he might have looked. He's also wearing very, very high quality clothes, some of the highest quality cloth we have on board. And so there's a good chance that he is Captain Hans Jonsson, the one person we know who's from the historical records, who's usually referred to as Old Captain Jonsson, and who was on board as a guest and consultant. He's the only person out of our 15 skeletons who could be Hans Jonsson. And it's just fortuitous that he's skeleton Johan, because Johan and Hans are the same name. They're the Swedish version of John. And then we have Gustav, except Gustav is probably not Gustav. His identity or her identity, or his identity has gone back and forth since the excavation. The initial osteologist determined that individual G was a woman. The osteologist in the 1990s determined that G was a man, so acquired the name Gustav. But recent osteological examination plus the DNA analysis indicates that Gustav is actually Gisela, that this skeleton is female. The artist who did the facial reconstruction was very relieved to hear that, because what he had said was that using the tissue thicknesses and musculature for a male skull did not work very well when he was trying to reconstruct this face. And he struggled with this one more than any other. But when we said, well, what if G was in fact a woman? And his response was, oh, well, that works much better. The musculature would fit much better on the skull. But this kind of difficulty in identifying gender is something that is not uncommon in archaeology. Not every skeleton is readily identifiable as male or female. And as we know today, we no longer think socially in terms of a strict male-female divide, but there's a spectrum in between, even if most people in society tend to be, or tend to identify themselves as either male or female. We've also been looking at and initiated a large project to look at how these people dressed. It's one of the clearest choices one has as an individual to express your own identity. It also is something that tells us a lot about the structure of society. In the case of Vasa's crew, we know that about 85% of them were conscripts, not necessarily professional mariners, but farm boys who were forcibly recruited into the Navy. And the Navy did not provide uniforms. Naval raiding certainly didn't get uniforms in the Swedish military until late in the 18th century. So they came in the clothes that they owned. And so what we have on board is a cross-section of how Swedes dressed in the 17th century, including women. The collection we have consists of about 5,500 individual identifiable fragments of textiles, as well as about 6,300 fragments of leather. And some of these are from complete items, as you see here, and some of them can be quite fragmentary. Some of these give examples of the range of material we have. And what looks like a jacket and wadded up trousers in the center upper image were the clothes that their skeleton Helge was wearing when he died. They were found with his skeleton in them. Whereas the jacket on the bottom right was found inside a chest of personal belongings. And some of these are quite well preserved. This is most of the remains of a jacket. There's sufficient of this that we could reconstruct exactly how it looked. And in addition to the individual pieces of it, there's a lot of evidence in the form of stitch holes, gatherings, and other traces of the other bits that were sewn to this. So it would be possible to make quite a complete reconstruction. In the center, you're looking at the back of the jacket. The center right is the right front of the jacket. On the right lower piece is the skirt, and the piece all the way on the left is part of the sleeve of a very fancy style that was made with a big slit down the front of it so that you could see the shirt underneath, which is a very fashionable thing to do in the 17th century. Among the shoes, we have shoes, boots, overshoes, but we also have the sorts of items that you would use to make and mend shoes. We have 11 shoe lasts on board, as well as lots of material for making and repairing shoes. So there's probably some people on board who were trained shoemakers. We otherwise don't know a lot about what ordinary people looked like in the 17th century. Almost all the preserved textile remains we have from this period are from the upper classes, kings and princes mostly. And even then, we don't have their everyday clothes. What we have are their coronation robes or their wedding suits. So we don't really have a good idea of what everyday clothing looked like in the 17th century, except for the occasional image, such as pictures of conscript armies in battle, or there's a series of watercolors that were done in the later 17th century of peasants from different districts in Sweden, which is a little unusual. The material that we have preserved is mostly wool and with a little bit of silk. Animal fibers tends to survive underwater much better than plant-based fiber does. But we do have a little bit of plant-based fiber, what we call bast here, which means it's fiber made from the lining of the woody stems of some kinds of plants. And we believe that's either linen or hemp, which are very difficult to tell apart archaeologically. That doesn't survive very well, although we do have the sails, which are made out of hemp. But we do have fragments that are probably the linings of garments in that material. And in one case, we do have paper, which was used as a stiffener for a lace collar. The textile techniques represented are all the ones we know about from historical sources: weaving, felting, just wetting and mashing up the fibers together, knoll binding, which is a single needle knotting technique. For people who don't know what that means, I tend to say it's a little bit like macrame or knitting with one needle, although people who do know what that means get really angry when I say that. But it's you use one needle and a continuous thread, and you knot it continuously. That's the bit on the upper right. And it tends to look a little bit like knitting. We have conventional knitting, the lower piece, which is a hat with a zigzag stripe motif in it, and tablet weaving, which is a particular type of weaving for making narrow bands. The one at the bottom is a mixed silk and wool tablet woven band, probably a hat band. It's important that we also look at the context of this material. This is the forward end of the upper gun deck, the uppermost preserved deck, with different finds of textiles marked in different colors to indicate what kind of find they are. The ones in orange are loose finds, textiles recovered without any other specific context. The ones in red, that's a stupid choice of mine to use orange and red, of course, but they're in blocks. Those are closed finds. Those are textiles found inside containers, mostly chests and barrels. And then we also have some finds that are directly associated with human remains, such as the jacket that the skeleton Helga was wearing when he was found. We also have buttons. They're the green indications here. And then we have textiles associated with shoes, usually liners or socks that were found inside shoes, generally indicating they're being worn. Those are the blue indications. You can see that there's a big concentration all the way up in the bow. It looks like all of the personal possessions for the ordinary crew were jammed up into the bow on the gun decks when the ship sailed. And then the finds farther aft are mostly those associated with skeletons. This is an example of a closed find. It was called the hat chest because when they opened it, this is what they saw, a big broad-brimmed hat. And these are the sorts of things that were found in that chest. There's the big broad-brimmed hat, which is in excellent condition, very high quality. And in fact, all of this is relatively high quality material, suggesting the person was relatively well off. But also a spare pair of shoes, galoshes, some nice mittens, even a little keg of spirits, probably, as well as material to repair his clothing, a thimble and a ball of silk thread. But some finds are a little more difficult to interpret. This is a large textile find found on the upper gun deck on the port side. And on the left, some of it has been reassembled onto a backing cloth. And on the right are the remaining fragments from this find, 9014A. In the 1960s, this was used to reassemble an entire sailor's dress on this particularly creepy looking reconstruction. This is a pastiche of garments from different find contexts. You can see the mittens from the hat chest, for example, and the shoes he's wearing are actually overshoes from the hat chest. But the trousers that were made up here are a particularly bad example of museological reconstruction. So the find I just showed you is that piece making up the front of the right leg. This is another find making up the front of the left leg. But this is the danger of having people doing reconstructions who don't actually know clothing, because that fragment is not, in fact, a trouser leg. It's the sleeve to a jacket. But these were sewn together to make this reconstruction. This is all of the fragments that I started with, 9014, put together and matched up based on using, in some cases, discontinuous threads or odd threads in the weave to puzzle it back together, and then even seams. And what we see from this is it's not a pair of trousers. We know what trousers look like. We have some better preserved ones. This is a pair of trousers, but this is too long. Trousers in this point only came down to the knee, and this garment is 85 centimeters long and has a pleated waistband. And so we wonder, well, what is it if it's not a pair of trousers? It is the full width of the cloth and has a pleated waistband. So we looked at the context. The black numbers here are human bones, and then the orange ones are textile finds. You'll see 9014 is sort of in the middle of the screen, and it's found together with a bunch of human bones. The sleeve is actually part of 03261, which is over towards the right, which is found with some more human bones. In fact, all these bones go together. They make up a female skeleton, a skeleton we call Beata, who appears to have died on a gun carriage because as her body broke down, the upper half of her body fell to one side of the gun carriage, to the right. So the bones found with the sleeve, and which also include the back of a jacket, are ribs and arm bones and a skull. The bones found with 9014 are leg and foot bones. So we have a long garment with a pleated waistband found with the lower body of a female skeleton. What might that be? So all of those belong together, and all of those belong together. We do have, in fact, an incomplete outfit for Beata. That garment is her skirt. We have most of her jacket, at least enough to reconstruct it, to see how it's constructed, what it's made of. And we even have her shoes, which are interesting. This is a shoe that is a very high quality shoe in goat skin with decorative stitching, but it's probably secondhand because it's been repaired by being resold, and the person who resold it just did an abysmal job. It's a very low quality, cheap repair to the sole of a high quality shoe. And so, to finish up, if we put all this together, meet Beata. She was found, her bones were found partly mixed with the skeleton of a 30 to 35-year-old man, whom we call Caesar. And in fact, both of our female skeletons were found next to male skeletons, suggesting that they might be married couples. So she's possibly married to Caesar. She's a woman, 20 to 25 years old, about 160 to 162 centimeters tall, average for the time. DNA shows she has brown eyes, and chemical analysis show that she suffered from poor nutrition, either anemia or chronic diarrhea or something like that. So she was not in the best of health. And in fact, we're very lucky that a Dutch artist, Jacob Cuyp, painted her, not really her, of course, but somebody a lot like her, that we can tell she was wearing a reddish brown jacket of this type, a darker skirt, secondhand repaired shoes, and she's even wearing a shawl. If we look at under a microscope at the back of her jacket, one of the things we found there are a large number of individual fibers of colored silk, red and blue, a lot of green, yellow, white. And we think what that is, that's lint from the embroidery on a linen shawl that she was wearing, which was a popular type of garment at that time, probably with floral designs on it. We believe that if we can map the individual fiber locations, we may be able to get some idea of what the pattern on that shawl was. And she was on board, probably as the wife of one of the sailors. She might have stayed on board, although she's wearing kind of nice things at the moment. She may have been a guest who would have gotten off later that day, had she not died when the ship sank. But she's a part of the shipboard community, which are not strictly male communities. We know that several different navies, including the Royal Navy, tolerated women on board. There were women on board English warships at Trafalgar, for example. And so they need to be considered as part of a larger shipboard community and part of the larger community of people associated with naval vessels in this period. Thank you.